For the rest of this chapter, I want to discuss the early period of the civil rights movement. And one of the things that I'm going to do is kind of go back and bring us up to date, leading up to the 1950s, what kinds of things were leading us towards the civil rights movement. It's sometimes easy to forget that the civil rights movement does not just spring from nothing in 1954 with the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education decision, although many textbooks begin with that. It takes decades and decades of chipping away at prejudice and racism in society to kind of build us up to what becomes the civil rights movement. One of the other things that I find many of my students kind of have trouble with is just wondering, why did we need a civil rights movement? These events seem so distant in our past, and while there are certainly racial issues in our country today, and things are not perfect, I think about the recent trend the last couple of years that have seen a distressing number of what seem to be racist attacks by white police upon black victims. It remains to be seen how all of that plays out, but it's certainly a sign that there remain, deep kind of racial issues in our country. Nonetheless, blacks in today's society seem to be able to advance through society relatively unchecked. There are many, many very successful and wealthy blacks in our society. So it's hard to recall a time when those sorts of advances were literally impossible. So we need first to just kind of look back on society. What were things like prior to the civil rights movement? And while we could go back much farther, I'll just take you back to the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896, which I described to you in a previous lecture. This is one of the most important Supreme Court decisions in our history, and it established the precedent of separate but equal. And so remember that I described to you after Plessy versus Ferguson, a whole series of these Jim Crow laws went into effect that mandated things like separate railroad cars, separate water fountains, separate schools, separate waiting rooms, and so on. Which leads us to the society that we have seen up to this point, and that you see in the picture there at the right. This gentleman coming out of what is labeled the colored waiting room. And so in order to understand why did we need a civil rights movement, where is this coming from, you have to put yourself in that mindset. Imagine living in a society in which you had to go into that waiting room, separate waiting rooms for white and black. And what that must have done just to the collective psyche and mindset of an entire race of people. So we'll look at a few other examples of this in the slides to come. A few years back, I had the privilege to go to Birmingham, Alabama, and they have an outstanding civil rights museum in Birmingham. Birmingham was in some ways at the epicenter of the civil rights movement, especially in the early 1960s. There are a lot of landmarks there of the movement. And the museum did an excellent job in one element or one area of the museum, where they actually kind of laid out, and you walked down this hallway, and on one side was black society, and on the other side was white society. And they kind of took you forward through time and through different elements of life. But it really drove home the fact that separate but equal was really not equal. And so I'll just read the caption to this part of their display. Barriers, 1920s to 1950s. From its earliest days, Birmingham was a city of two worlds, black and white. People lived and worked side by side, but separation of the races and double standards were facts of life. Here and throughout the South, unequal opportunity was a barrier to the hopes and dreams of nearly half the population. One of the areas where we see these kind of barriers was in transportation. And again, it's one thing, I guess, to hear or read about, segregated seating on the buses, but when you look at a picture like this one, you see how stark the reality was in actual life for people who had to live with this. And we can see that there is a sign there for white passengers. White passengers sit in front of the sign and black passengers behind. And if you just look at the state of this bus, there are what appear to be several empty seats in front of the sign, the white section. And in the back of the bus, there are black people even having to stand up. It's so full in the back of the bus. This is the kind of situation, by the way, that Rosa Parks very famously confronted, and we'll talk about her shortly. But you could understand that after a lifetime of this kind of reality and having to ride under these sorts of conditions, that one might feel inclined at some point to protest. We also see the disparity, this idea of separate but equal in the schools. And here are some of the displays that were in that museum in Birmingham. And you see on the left the white classroom. And while by our modern standards even that might seem pretty humble, by the standards of the day, the 1940s or 50s, that was top-of-the-line technology. Meantime, the black classroom on the right is still stuck back in the 1800s, really, with old wooden desks and kind of run-down conditions. Now, of course, this is only a museum display. It's kind of crafted to suit the needs, but that is really how the situation was. And so what we see is that it really wasn't separate but equal, of course. It was separate but unequal. And finally, there is simply the reality of racism and segregation in everyday life. What to us would be completely politically incorrect and would simply never be allowed, in that era was just an accepted everyday fact. And so you look at the picture of this vehicle here. We wash for white people only. Just kind of churns the stomach to even think that that a business would put that on the side of their delivery truck. But at that time, it was completely accepted, and certainly white people wouldn't have thought twice about it. We can only wonder how black people would have felt having to see that and live that and experience it every single day. So recognizing how bad conditions were and recognizing that we needed something like the civil rights movement to force changes in society, the question then becomes, well, why did it take so long? Why didn't we have a civil rights movement prior to the 1950s and 60s if conditions had been that way for so long? Well, the answer in part is what we see on the screen. And again, I spoke to you in an earlier lecture about the prominence of lynching and violence. But the reality is that occasionally some people did try to protest, or people did break the rules and break conventions of the day. And this is what was likely to happen to them. Violence, lynching, people could be attacked or killed. It doesn't take too many episodes like this before people stop challenging the status quo and stop protesting and just learn to accept and live with it. The lynching of Emmett Till, which your textbook describes in lengthy detail, and I encourage you to go over that section as well, is just one example of this. The realities of what even very mild breaches of etiquette could result in. Another way of answering that question, why did it take so long, why do we not have a civil rights movement before, is that in fact there were elements. There were efforts to move things forward. There were people trying to make change. But again, within this realm of if you step too boldly across the line, you might just wind up dead.